Welcome to the lecture. This is called the Etiology of Obesity, and this is the first part of my of a six-part series looking at basically what the cause of obesity is, and then later on we'll get into how we can deal with that. So let me start with a story. This is William Banting. He was a London undertaker, and he lived in the 1796 to 1878. And basically, he had become very obese through the years. Starting in his mid-30s, he had started to gain a few pounds every year until by age 62, he had weighed about 202 pounds, which was really quite obese for that time. And not being too happy with that whole situation, he decided that he would do something about it. So what he did was he went to see some physicians, and they gave him some various advice, such as increasing the exercise. So living near the Thames, he actually took up rowing, and he decided that he would row every day. The problem was that he said that he developed a very healthy appetite, but in the end he wasn't able to lose any weight. So he went to see some other esteemed doctors at the time, and they told him, well, all you need to do is decrease your caloric intake and you'll automatically lose weight. But what he found was that he was just tired and hungry, and he still wasn't able to lose weight. So eventually he came to the attention of a French surgeon who told him about a specific diet which involved eating 3 meals a day of meat, fish, or game with just very little stale toast or cooked fruit on the side. And what happened was that he avoided very strenuously these fattening carbohydrates, which were sugar and starch, so the bread, beer, sweets, potatoes. And what he found was that he actually was able to lose a significant amount of weight very quickly. So he published this in a letter called Letter on Corpulence, published in 1863. And it actually quickly became one of the best-selling diet books of its time, and is really considered one of the first diets. This sort of idea about obesity actually persisted for quite a few years. So William Osler, who is considered the father of modern medicine, he authored the textbook, The Principles and Practice of Medicine, which was very influential. In it, he discusses treatment of obesity, and much of his ideas are similar to Banting, and they featured lean beef, veal, mutton, and eggs. And that was his opinion. He actually had published a monograph himself on obesity and its treatment, and his thought was that what needed to be eaten was fatty foods. They're crucial, actually, because they increase satiety and therefore decrease fat accumulation. His idea, of course, was very similar to Banting in that one needed to strenuously avoid the fattening carbohydrates. Up until the 1950s and 60s, this idea was fairly prevalent. It wasn't really a secret in any way. If you look at standard textbooks, or even for the address to the lay public at the time, such as Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care, things hadn't progressed much beyond that. What he noted was that rich desserts, the amount of plain starchy foods taken, is what determines, in the case of most people, how much weight they gain or lose. And in the British Journal of Nutrition in 1963, Dr. Passmore writes, every woman knows that carbohydrate is fattening. That is, this was fairly common knowledge. That is, if you eat fattening carbohydrates, not all carbohydrates, but the starchy foods, the sugary foods, the sweets, they are going to lead you to obesity. And that was pretty well the prevalent thinking at its time. Things started to change in the 1950s and 1960s with the great so-called epidemic of coronary disease. And what this was as we industrialized, what we noted was that there was an increasing incidence of coronary disease. So in the 1950s, dietary fat increasingly became vilified for its effect on LDL cholesterol, the so-called diet heart hypothesis. And by the 1960s, the American Medical Association was insisting that these so-called low-carbohydrate diets were a fad. Of course, they really were anything but a fad, having been used for close to 200 years. the vitriol was so extreme that John Meyer, who was a prominent nutritionist of his time, actually said that these carbohydrate-restricted diets was the equivalent of mass murder. We were killing people with these reducing diets. The problem was this, of course, that if fat was the problem, then you necessarily had to eat a high carbohydrate diet if you're going to eat low fat, because fat and protein tend to travel together. However, the fattening carbohydrate could not be healthy in that it's low fat, and unhealthy at the same time because it causes obesity. So in order to resolve this cognitive dissonance, all of a sudden the fattening carbohydrate suddenly turned into the healthy whole grain. The fat, with its dense calories, was simply assumed to cause obesity, even though there was really no proof, anecdotal or otherwise, to sustain that. The model that we think about obesity, instead of being the fattening carbohydrate model, all of a sudden became this calories in, calories out model. And that's where we were in the 1970s. There was still a significant amount of debate, of course, between the dietary fat proponents and the dietary carbohydrate, refined carbohydrate camp. And this was settled not by scientific dispute, but really by dictum, by government. In 1977, the U.S. Department of Agriculture published for the first time this dietary goals for the United States. And this was the first time, really, that any government institution had told Americans that they could really improve their health by eliminating or reducing the fat in their diets. So this is a copy of the USDA dietary guidelines. And what you can see very prominently is that you should avoid too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. And what you should eat is actually adequate starch. So instead of avoiding the fatty carbohydrates, you should really eat more. And this dietary fat controversy turned from a scientific controversy into a political one. And it came down really on the side of eating more carbohydrates. This explicitly determined goal was to raise the consumption of carbohydrates until they constituted 55 to 60% of calories, and to decrease the fat consumption from approximately 40% to 30%. And this is what gives us the very familiar food pyramid, which is meats at the top, eggs, poultry, fish, weekly or even monthly. And at the bottom, what you should be eating every single day is bread, pasta, rice, and whole grains. Physical activity, of course, is very important. It got to the point in 1995, if you were to look at an American Heart Association diet, that this is what they wrote. To control the amount and kind of fat, saturated fatty acids, and dietary cholesterol you eat, choose snacks from other food groups such as low-fat cookies, low-fat crackers, unsalted pretzels, hard candy, gumdrops, sugar, syrup, honey, jam. In other words, it really didn't matter how much sugar was in your snack or in your diet. It only mattered how much fat there was. So things like this, which is candy, is entirely fine to eat as long as you're cutting the fat. So how did we do? How did we do as a nation? Well, it turns out that we actually did pretty well. If you look at what happened, we made a very conscious effort to eat less fat, less red meat, fewer eggs. And if you look at the average fat consumption of Americans, it decreased from about 45% of calories to about 35%. If you look at what else we told them to do, so, get your blood pressure checked, get your blood pressure treated, to stop smoking, to treat your cholesterol, we did very well as well. So 40% decline in hypertension, 28% decline in hypercholesterolemia. So it turns out we did very well. So in fact, you can't really say that the public wasn't listening to us. In fact, they had listened to the advice of the time and tried really their very best to comply, and they did. We told them to eat less fat and eat more carbohydrates, and that is what they did. So if you look at the changes in the U.S. food availability, you can see that butter, eggs, and animal protein, such as meat, significantly decreased from the 1960s to today, and what we ate instead was what we were told to eat, grains and sugars. If you look at the U.S. Sugar consumption through the years, you can see through the 1800s there's a steadily rising increase in the amount of sugar per capita that Americans were eating. And this really reflects the increased availability of the sugar as sugar plantations kind of spread throughout the Caribbean and the U.S. South. By the time you hit the 1920s, you can see that there really is not that much more that we are going to eat. And we enter a sort of flat period from the 1920s to about 1977. By the time they tell us that eating sugar is just fine, you can see that there's this secondary spike in the amount of sugar that we eat. If you look at grain, which is the most important of which is wheat, you can see that in 1950, the per capita consumption was approximately 125 pounds per day. And in the 1960s, it decreased slightly. In the 1970s, decreased down to 113. But by 1980, it had gone up to 122. By 1990, 141. And 2000, 146. Total grain products shows a very similar distribution. And what happened to weight? Well, you can see that there had been a very slowly increasing incidence of obesity over the previous years, but when you hit, there's a clear tipping point right here. In 1977, when they released the first dietary guidelines for Americans, where you can see that the curve really changes. That is, instead of a slowly rising increase in the prevalence of obesity, it takes a very sudden, sharp turn for the worse. So this is the way that we understand obesity now. The reason we don't actually think about what causes obesity is because we actually think that we know what causes it. And this is what we think. So this is caloric reduction as primary theory. That is, it's all about the calories, sometimes called calories in, calories out. So this is obesity. And what causes obesity? Well, it's clear that you either eat too much or you exercise too little. And really, those are personal choices or behaviors. So that is the way that many of us think about obesity as it currently stands. And there's a few implicit assumptions in that theory that you may or may not realize. But a calorie is a calorie. That is, calorie of sugar is no different than a calorie of fat. The fat stores are essentially unregulated. That is, it's simply a dump for excess calories. So if there's an imbalance here, it will be simply dumped into the body as fat. The intake and the expenditure of calories are under your conscious control. That is, we make all the decisions on how much we eat and how much we exercise, which sort of ignores the effect of hunger as well as basal metabolic rate. But one of the more important assumptions to this theory is that the intake and the expenditure of calories are independent of each other. That is to say, if you eat more, it doesn't have any impact on how much exercise you do. If you exercise more, it similarly doesn't have any impact on what you eat. And we'll go through this to see if that actually is true. And it's usually depicted as some kind of a scale. That is, this is the calories in, calories out model. If you, have too much to eat or too little exercise, it kind of shifts the balance and therefore you gain weight. And usually what people say is that it's the so-called first law of thermodynamics. And the accumulation of this fat is due to this caloric imbalance. And this is true in a technical sense, but it's not really as useful as you think that it is. As an example, if you go to an airport in March break and it's really, really crowded, and you turn to your friend who's a doctor and say, wow, it's really crowded here. And I wonder why that is. And your doctor friend says, well, it's really very simple. There's either too few people leaving or too many people coming in. And while that's true, it's not particularly useful. The real reason more people are coming in than leaving is because it's March break. It's the same with calories, yes. In the end, it always boils down to calories, but really the question is what's driving the calories in and what's driving the calories out. And in our way of thinking, it's a behavioral problem. That is, we control what we take and we control what we expend, therefore it's a behavioral problem. And of course it became a very popular theory. In fact, most of us still believe it today. And it's because it is very easy to understand and it appeals to people's sense of self-determinism. That is, you're captain of your own ship and you're in control. And if you're overweight, really it boils down, are you a glutton or are you a sloth? And that's the way we think of it. And obesity is not so much a medical condition, but some kind of psychological defect, some character defect due to low willpower or some such assumption. If you look at the textbooks, in fact, you will see that they are full of theories like this and full of what to do about it based on this caloric reduction as primary theory. That is, if you look at, for instance, Jocelyn's Diabetes, a very authoritative textbook on the treatment of diabetes, reduction of caloric intake is the cornerstone of any therapy for obesity. Of course, it recognizes at the same time that low-calorie and very low-calorie diets, none of these approaches has any proven merit. The Handbook of Obesity, dietary therapy remains the cornerstone of treatment, and reduction of energy intake continues to be the basis of successful weight reduction. Again, they realize that the results of such diets are known to be poor and not long-lasting. So even if you talk to experts, they still say that reduction of caloric intake really is the basis of treatment. So if this is the way we think, that is, caloric reduction is primary, so this is the way things are, then it's really a very easily tested hypothesis. Because if you think that somebody's obesity is caused by eating too much or exercising too little, all we have to do is change how much you eat. And if that is really the causal factor, then we should see a difference in the obesity. Well, just remember that the key assumption is that the caloric intake and expenditure are independent of each other. It turns out that this is not a very new idea at all. In fact, it was done close to 100 years ago, where they took 12 men and put them onto these so-called semi-starvation diets of 1,400 to 2,100 calories a day. And what was found was that the subjects, they did lose weight, but they constantly complained of being cold. And when you measure their basal metabolism, what you see that there is a very significant decrease, a 30% decrease in their metabolic rate. And that explains why they're cold. The body was shutting down. It was turning down heat production as a way of reducing caloric expenditure. So it turns out that you reduce your energy expenditure so much that if you go back to your regular diet after this period, then what happens is that you start to gain fat. You start to gain weight. And they also measured all these things, including decreases in blood pressure, heart rate, inability to concentrate. All these are manifestations of the body really starting to shut down. A similar study was done by Ansel Keys in 1944, where he took 36 men and put them on a 24-week semi-starvation diet, 1,570 calories a day, and again measured what happened to their metabolism. It turns out that the men's resting metabolic rates declined by 40%. So again, heart volume shrank, heart rate slowed, and the body temperature dropped. There was all kinds of psychological effects. Some people went actually completely crazy, but they were obsessed about food, and there was binge eating and all sorts of problems. So what we see is that one of the key assumptions of the caloric reduction model is actually not true. That is, if you look at caloric intake and caloric expenditure, they are very intimately linked. In fact, if you look at more recent data from the New England Journal of Medicine, a very prominent medical journal from 1995, what they did was they measured something very similar. That is, they took people at an initial weight and they increased their weight by 10% or decreased it by 10%. And what they did then is they looked at what their basal metabolism did. And how they did this was they adjusted their diet, a liquid diet, and they gave them more or they gave them less until they achieved what they wanted in terms of weight. And this is what you found in terms of basal energy expenditure. That is, as you gain weight, your body actually starts to rev up and starts to burn off those calories. And as you lose weight, your body, well, as you return to initial weight, you go back to normal. As you lose weight, your body actually starts to shut it down. So far from being completely independent of each other, it seems that the body has compensatory mechanisms to actually return you to your initial weight. And in fact, these changes happen not only right away, but they actually persist for a surprisingly long amount of time. That is, even a year after your weight loss, so after a 10% weight loss, this is from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, after a 10% weight loss 1 year later, what they found was that the total energy expenditure was already down. And it stayed down. So it goes down right away and it stays down. If you look at the hormonal adaptation to weight loss, this is a more recent study in the New England Journal of Medicine, 2011. They took people and gave them very low-calorie diets, so 500 calories a day for 10 weeks, and they're able to make them all lose weight. So they wanted to see what happened after they lose weight. Well, after a year, what you can do is you can measure their hormones. So ghrelin, the so-called hunger hormone, is actually, even after a year, significantly higher than where it was before you lost that weight. These ones, peptide YY, CCK, they're all satiety hormones. That is, they tell the body that you're full, and you can see that they are lower than it normally would be in response to a standardized meal. If you look at their feelings of hunger, you can see that this is the baseline, and after a year of weight loss, these changes have not gone away. People are hungrier than they used to be. And if you look at their desire to eat, is much the same. They are wanting to eat. So in fact, what happens to the body in response to weight loss is actually the body tries furiously to get you back to the original weight. That is, there are hormonal signals that tell you to eat, that make you hungry, and tell you that you need to return to your weight. And if that doesn't happen, well, the body actually will start to shut it down. Because if you're not going to eat more, the body has to shut it down in order to get that weight up. So in fact, far from being a scale, the body acts far more like a thermostat. That is, there appears to be a set weight at which the body wants to be. And if you go above that weight, the body will try and bring you down. As you go below that set weight, your body wants you to raise up. So this is what they found. A 10% increase in weight actually led to a 16% increase in energy expenditure. A 10% decrease in weight leads to a 15% decrease in energy expenditure. So in fact, these are physiologic changes which are aimed at increasing the metabolic efficiency and fuel supply of the tissues at a time of energy deficit. That is, if you're not eating enough, the body will either shut it down or try and get you to eat more. That is, the body is actually very smart. Body fat is actually finely regulated. And what do I mean the body is smart? Well, think about this. Suppose you're the manager of a coal plant, okay? So I've depicted food as coal. That's your energy, okay? And you run the power plant. You need to put out energy. And you have a certain amount in storage. And you'd like to keep that amount in storage for times of need. So what would happen if, as the manager of that plant, all of a sudden you saw a 30% decrease in the amount of coal that you are getting in? Would you say, well, let's just burn the same amount of coal even though I'm getting 30% less? I'll burn the same amount and have the same amount of energy out. When I exhaust my stores, then we'll just shut it down. We'll just turn it off. Well, no, that wouldn't be very smart. You'd probably get fired. What would you do? If you saw a 30% reduction in the coal that's coming in, what you would probably do is turn down your power plant 35 or 40%, just in case there's further decreases in the supply of coal. And the body does exactly the same thing because it's smart. It doesn't want to die. Okay, so if you have a reduction in the calories coming in, the body's going to think, wow, I need to start shutting it down. I need to match what's coming in to what's going out so that I can maintain a reserve, a storage reserve. Because if you didn't, you'd just die. So let's see what happens in the real world, because really this caloric reduction model, we've been testing it continuously. And probably the biggest trial that's ever been done is the Women's Health Initiative Dietary Modification Trial. And this was started in 1993, and it was a huge, very expensive trial. 50,000 women, and they were enrolled to either a low-fat diet, rich in fruits, vegetables, and fiber, and about 30,000, roughly, who just took kind of what they usually took. They used dietary counseling to make sure that people got what they thought they would get. And let's look at what happened. So if you look at total energy, at baseline, they were taking 1,788 calories per day. And at follow-up, they were taking 1,445 calories a day. So they were taking 361.4 calories less every single day. If you look at percentage fat, they went from 38.8% to 29.8%, which is very good. That's exactly what they were trying to do. And as a result, the amount of energy from carbohydrate went up from 44% to 52%. At the same time, they tried to exercise more. So if you look at the METs per week, which is a unit of exercise, they went from 10 to 11.4. In other words, they increased their physical activity by roughly 10%. So that's great. They ate less and they exercised more. So what happened to their weight? That's the question. So compared to the people with a normal diet, the people who took this very stringent 360 calorie reduction diet every day plus increased exercise, they barely lost any weight compared to the usual group over a period of up to 7 to 9 years. There was barely any difference. Less than 1 kilogram difference between the two groups. It simply doesn't work. So if you look at what they should have lost, everybody says, oh, well, if you're reducing 360 calories a day and a pound of fat is 3,000, you should have lost 36 pounds of fat in the first year alone. But in fact, their weight went from 76.8 kilos to 75.7 kilos, which is barely a kilogram of weight lost. But the problem with that is actually they lost lean mass as well as fat mass, because if you look at their waist circumference, it actually went up from 89 centimeters to 90 centimeters. So the cruel hoax of all these semi-starvation diets, or simply calorie-restricted, low-fat, calorie-restricted diets, is they do not work. Okay? It has a perfect 35-year track record, unblemished by success, because caloric deprivation triggers two adaptive mechanisms which are going to work against you. You're going to reduce your energy output, and you're going to increase your hunger. So in the end, it's a self-defeating cycle. They don't work. And it's a cruel hoax because these women tried so hard for 7 or 8 years, depriving themselves, exercising for no benefit. In the end, they were just fatter than ever. And this is the vicious cycle of undereating. So as you eat less calories, you start to lose a bit of weight. Your body says, well, hey, I'm losing weight. I need to control this. So you decrease your energy expenditure and you increase your hunger. But you still don't eat because you're trying to lose weight. So you regain a bit, but then you double down, right? You redouble your efforts and you eat even less calories. And you lose a bit more weight, but then the body says, hey, I need to decrease my energy expenditure further and increase my hunger. And then as you start to gain weight, you have to eat even less calories than that. And it circles around and around until it's completely intolerable. And then we blame the victim. Then we blame the person on the diet, saying that you don't have enough willpower or you are cheating on your diet. And it's all the health professionals. They have all said that. But it's simply not true. That's not what happened. It wasn't a lack of willpower. If you think that eating too much is really the cause of obesity, well, again, you can test that very simply. If you give people more to eat, then they should get fat. And these experiments have been done as well, ever since the 1960s, most famously by an endocrinologist by the name of Ethan Sims. So he took convicts at a Vermont state prison. And he initially did it in college students, but he couldn't make them eat enough. So he took, inmates where you could control what they ate. And they were eating up to 4,000 calories a day. And their weight would go up, but then it kind of stabilized. Some wound up eating 10,000 calories a day. And when you measure their metabolic rate, their metabolism had increased by 50%. The body was simply trying to burn it off. Again, if we go back to the coal analogy, if all of a sudden you're getting so much more coal, you're not just going to leave it. You're going to say, well, I have way too much coal. Let's burn it. And that's what the body does. If you look at this, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, they also took volunteers and they overfed them for 42 days. Okay? And they followed a diet which is fairly standard for North America, which is about 46% carbohydrate. And what happened? Well, they all gained weight. But as you take them off of that force feeding, they all go back towards their usual weight, except for this fellow who continued to gain weight. But most people started to drift back down towards their natural weight, naturally. This is not an experimental condition. This is what they did on their own. So again, you can see the body acts more as a thermostat, not as a scale. So the caloric reduction is primary. There's a couple of problems with the way we perceive why we get fat, the etiology of obesity. One is that eating less does not result in weight loss. That is, it simply induces hunger and reduces energy expenditure. Eating more does not result in weight gain. So if you try and overfeed people, what happens is that they simply burn it off until that condition resolves, and then they go back to their usual weight. So the body acts as a thermostat, and the caloric deprivation is difficult because it's a fight against the mechanisms which have evolved to precisely minimize its effects. That is, we think that restricting the coal will result in lower fat, but it simply results in less power being burned, less power coming out. So we've got the wrong idea about the etiology of obesity. That is, we don't understand what it is that makes us fat, and that is probably the single most important reason why we've been losing the fight against obesity. The ultimate proof, really, is all of you. Because I think everybody in this room, including myself, has tried to eat a little bit less to lose weight. And yeah, it works in the short term, but in the end, it doesn't work. In your hearts, you know it doesn't work. Everybody knows it doesn't work. Yet that's what the experts still tell you. But things are changing. The other part of the caloric reduction model, of course, is the exercise more. So one of the major things is that we say, well, if it's not a matter of calories in, it's a matter of calories out. We need to exercise more. So if you look at how much exercise we've been doing, actually we've been doing more and more exercise. If you look at leisure time physical activity, we've been exercising more. Up until the 1960s, in fact, many doctors actually thought exercise was bad for you. If you go back, to heart disease patients, they would prescribe a week of bed rest with the idea that resting is better than exercising. So it wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s that people started to get the idea with the so-called fitness revolution that, yeah, we should be exercising a little bit more. But prior to that, it wasn't. Now experts routinely claim that exercising is actually the key to weight loss. But the problem is that it's very hard to see any kind of correlation. That is, if you look at the correlation between obesity and exercise, you can see that as we've been getting more obese, more and more people have been meeting their exercise recommendations. So it's hard to kind of reconcile those two facts. If you go back to the real world and see what happens in the real world, you can take this large cohort study published in JAMA 2010. That's the Journal of the American Medical Association. And they took 39,000 women and they grouped them into 3 different groups. One which did very little exercise, so METs hour per week, less than 7.5, a kind of intermediate group, and a group that did really a lot of exercise. And they wanted to follow them over 7 years and see who got more or less weight. So you can see that those who exercised less tended to be heavier. But those weights were actually quite stable through the years. That is, over 5, 6, 7 years of exercising more, and this is as much as an hour a day every day, you can see that they don't actually gain any more or lose any more weight than those who do 0. If you look in this model of how much more weight you would lose by doing exercise over 3 years of 1 hour per day, you would lose an average of an extra 0.12 kilograms, or just about 1/4 of a pound. That's the difference in weight. You would go from 0 exercise to an hour a day. So really very little at all. And it hardly seems enough to be the key to weight loss. A few years ago, this was published by Church in the Public Library of Science 2009. And what he did was he actually randomized women to several different groups of exercise. So one that doesn't do very much to increasing amounts of exercise. And what you can see is that there was actually no difference between all the groups. But if you look more closely, as you start to do more exercise, you actually start to lose less weight. If you look at other trials, in fact, almost every trial that's been done has shown something very similar. That is, published in Obesity 2007, they took 100 men and 100 women, and they put them on 6 days a week of 1 hour moderate to vigorous exercise. And they wanted to see how much weight they lost. So over 1 year, so going from sedentary or 0 exercise to an hour a day of aerobics, you lost about 3 pounds for women and 4 pounds for men. So yes, there is a difference, but really a very, very small difference. A group of researchers in Denmark actually took sedentary subjects and trained them to run a marathon with the thought that if a little bit of exercise is good for you, well, a lot of exercise must be good for you. And the problem was that the men only lost about 5 pounds in weight, and the women, they didn't have any weight lost at all. In fact, they say that no change in body composition was observed. That is, if you think that, well, they lost fat but gained lean muscle, well, in these women, they comment that they didn't see any difference in the amount of fat at all. And this is from going from sedentary to running a marathon. And this is the dirty little secret of exercise that nobody ever tells you about, but is really well documented. And this is something called compensation. That is, almost all studies lasting more than 25 weeks, people don't lose as much weight as they are predicted to weigh. And there's probably 2 different mechanisms. One is that as you exercise more, you probably naturally increase your caloric intake. And 2 is that as you do more prescribed physical activity, your spontaneous physical activity probably goes down. So if you look at this group from the Timothy Church study, you can see as they went and did more and more exercise, you can see that they started to eat more and more. That is, they went from 1730 to 1831 to 1870 calories a day. So as you're doing more exercise, you're going to eat more. Compensation, it can also occur because as you do more of the prescribed physical activity, you do less outside of that. And this is well documented in children. This study was done looking at children and phys ed in school. So some schools, of course, had a lot of phys ed, and some schools didn't have much physical education. And what they wanted to know was that are children more active or less active with that hour or 2 of physical activity at school? And it turns out that when you measure all these kids, it matters very little how much physical activity they get in school. Because those kids who are doing a lot of physical activity at school, when they got home, they weren't doing very much. And those who didn't do very much at school, when they got home, they did a lot. And that kind of makes sense. Basically, if you go out and you go to the gym and you go run around the track and do weights for a couple of hours, the last thing you really want to do when you come home is say, hey, maybe I should go for a little walk. But if you spend your whole day in the office doing nothing, you're going to come home and say, you know, a bicycle ride around the block seems like a really good idea. So there's a compensation effect, and really it comes down to this. Yeah, we'll go to the gym, but then we'll take the escalator to get there. And that's a possible mechanism of compensation. The other problem with exercise, really, is that there seems to be this notion that exercise is the majority of our caloric expenses. That is, you can measure how much energy somebody expends just lying in bed all day. And that's the basal energy expenditure. So you can calculate it, for instance, for a 140-pound person, just to sit down in bed all day, it takes about 2,200 calories per day. If you were to get up and walk for 45 minutes at a kind of moderate pace of 2 miles an hour, it would take about 102 calories. In other words, that extra energy that you expend by exercising is barely 4% of your daily caloric intake. So even if you go crazy on exercise, you might only get up to 6% or 8% of caloric intake. It's really a very small percentage of what we burn just to stay alive. So the majority of calories that we expend through the day is actually not in exercise. It's actually just heating the body. And that explains a couple of things. For instance, why do we get so hungry after swimming? Probably not the exercise. The exercise is important, but we're constantly cooling the body. The water is pulling off heat. And as we pull off the heat, we have to increase what we burn to heat our bodies back up. And why do patients on these semi-starvation diets get so cold? Well, the answer is because they don't have enough calories, so they're starting to shut down. The easiest thing to shut down is your temperature. So by focusing narrowly on this 4% of daily caloric expenditure and ignoring the other 96 is the reason why the exercise just isn't that important. So make no mistake, we should really all get exercise. I actually believe that quite a bit. It's just not that effective for weight loss. So there are many, many, many important reasons to do your exercise. There's the muscle tone, the insulin sensitivity, decreased vascular disease, bone density. There's all sorts of very important, very good reasons to exercise. But weight loss just is not one of the major things. So we can see by looking at this hypothesis, the way that we think about what makes us fat is that obesity is caused by eating too much and exercising too little is simply not true. It simply doesn't hold up in an experimental setting. And there's another theory of obesity which has mostly been forgotten but is being rediscovered, and that's the hormonal obesity theory. That is, if we think about the coal and the power plant, there's actually a little cop here, a little traffic cop, who directs things into storage. And that's the first thing that happens. When you take that energy, you want to maintain that storage at a certain level, the so-called set point. And the major player in determining how much food you keep in storage is insulin and to a lesser extent cortisol. And then the amount that you eat and the amount that you expend in your basal metabolic rate will adjust themselves in order to maintain this set point of storage or fat. So this is the way that we can think about obesity instead. That is, high levels of insulin or cortisol are going to lead to obesity, and this is going to lead to the behaviors of eating too much or exercising too little. There's a few implicit assumptions on this theory as well. For instance, fat, like all body systems, are regulated under tight hormonal control. That seems to make sense because there's virtually no system in the body which is not regulated. It's not simply a dump. The intake and the expenditure of calories are under hormonal control. So this takes into account the effect of hunger, for instance, and the basal metabolic rate. And the intake and the expenditure of calories are directly linked to each other, as we've seen, and not independent. So insulin is been used as a fattening agent for quite some time. In 1923, it was first used for underweight children. And in the 1930s, clinicians had started to use that already for pathologically underweight children. And when they gave insulin, these kids would gain weight. And the truth of the matter is that I can make you fat. I can make anybody fat. What do? I give them insulin. And any physician who's used insulin or any patient who's used insulin knows this to be true. It has nothing to do with character defect or lack of willpower. When you take insulin, you get fat. So if you look at this study, which is from the diabetes trial, type 1 diabetes, the DCCT trial, you can see that they had two groups. So one group of diabetics, they actually had very tight control of their sugars by giving more insulin. And the other group of patients, they had very loose control because that was the trial at the time. And what you can see is that the number of people with a major weight gain was significantly different between the two. That is, the number of people who are using more insulin, almost 30% of those people had weight problems, major weight problems, compared to those who didn't use so much insulin. If you look at the amount of weight they gained and correlate it to how much insulin they use, you can see there's a very strong correlation. That is, the total insulin dose, as it goes up, is correlated very strongly with the amount of weight that they would gain. If you look at type 2 diabetes, you actually see much the same thing. If you do intensive control of their diabetes by giving them more therapies that increase their insulin levels, they tend to gain more weight. Those ones that you don't control as tightly, they don't gain as much weight. In type 2 diabetes, they had a trial a few years ago when they're really concerned about controlling their glucose. And what they found was this. They took a group of people, a group of diabetics, and they gave them intensive insulin therapy. And they went from 0 units of insulin a day, and 6 months they had them up to 100 units a day of insulin. And what happened? Well, they all started to gain weight. And you can see that, again, there's a very tight correlation between the amount of insulin that you used and the total weight gain. In fact, the other interesting part about the study is that they gained on average 8.7 kilograms. But they also measured how much calories they're eating. So at baseline, they're eating 2,023 calories. By the end, they're eating 1,711 calories. That is, even though they were gaining weight, they were eating less and less. That is, they had reduced the amount of calories consumed by almost 15%. Yet under the influence of insulin, which is telling the body to get fat, they were still gaining weight. If you take a look at diabetics and give them different amounts of insulin to control their diabetes, again, in this study from the New England Journal of Medicine in 2007, you can see your body weight goes up as you take more insulin, and it correlates to the amount of insulin that you get. That is, these are different types of insulin, but as you get more insulin, that is a higher dose of the insulin, you get a higher weight gain. Insulin itself can cause local fat deposits, and this is a picture of something called insulin lipohypertrophy, which is the way that the insulin injections can actually cause localized deposits of fat. If you combine insulin with other agents that increase insulin, you can see that you get sulfonylurea, which is a drug which increases insulin levels. If you combine that with insulin, the insulin levels are going to go up even higher. And even though your sugars are better, you're going to gain more weight. A new class of drugs called dapagliflozin works in a different way. Now, you can add this to insulin to reduce the amount of insulin that you need. And what they did was this. They had 4 different groups. So one group was just the insulin group. And this, over the study period, these people, to control their sugars, were getting more and more insulin. And these people, instead of increasing their insulin, they were taking different doses of this new drug, which didn't raise the insulin levels. And if you look at the change in weight, you can see that those that are taking more and more insulin are gaining more and more weight. And those that are taking less insulin are losing their weight. And you see the same thing in type 2 diabetes with metformin. Metformin is a drug that does not raise the insulin levels but controls the sugars. And you can see that there was no difference between metformin and the control group in terms of weight gain, whereas glyburide, which is a drug that does raise the insulin level, does cause the weight gain. Weight gain is independent of the control of blood glucose because you can use these different drugs such as metformin. So the metformin group loses the most weight, but as you take drugs such as sulfonylurea, you actually gain more and more weight. Januvia, which is a new type of drug, which also doesn't raise the insulin levels all the time, is not associated with the weight gain. In fact, causes a little bit of weight loss compared to the older medications, which simply raise the insulin levels. And this is the same sort of thing with the dapagliflozin. As you add it to the body, you actually start to lose more and more weight. And not only is that weight, but you can measure it and see if it's fat tissue or lean muscle tissue, and much of that weight loss is actually fat tissue. So you can actually make a graph, excluding the TZD class, but you can make a graph of drugs which increase the basal insulin, and the sulfonylureas, and you can list a number of drugs that don't cause such a sustained increase in insulin levels. And if you look at what causes weight gain, it's almost the exact same list. That is, the insulin and drugs that raise the insulin levels cause weight gain. And those that do not raise insulin levels do not cause weight gain. And the reverse is also true. If you take away the insulin, people will lose weight. This is a picture of untreated type 1 diabetes. That is, these are people who, due to an autoimmune effect, actually have very, very low levels of insulin. And what you find is that they are skinny beyond belief. In fact, the classic description is a melting down of flesh and limbs into urine. And no matter what you feed them, no matter what you give them to eat, they still can't lose weight. They still can't gain weight. They will continue to lose weight until they die. When you give them the insulin back, all of a sudden, they gain their weight back. And this is actually fairly well known in the type 1 community, and it's actually called diabulimia. That is, a deliberate underdosing of their insulin in order to lose weight. So it's dangerous as hell and can kill them, but they know that they will lose weight. So they give them less insulin. That is, insulin causes weight gain. You can do the same sort of analysis with cortisol. That is, if you give people cortisol, which is a stress hormone, they will gain weight. So we can do that from a pharmacological standpoint by giving them steroids or a drug called prednisone, and they will gain weight. Almost everybody gains weight. In fact, anybody who has treated patients knows you give the steroids, they gain weight. There's also a condition called Cushing's disease where people overproduce this hormone, cortisol, and they also gain weight. The hallmark of Cushing's syndrome is weight gain. And if you don't have cortisol, it's a disease called Addison's disease. And again, one of the hallmarks of Addison's disease is weight loss. So you can see that really what causes weight gain and weight loss is not calories per se, it's really hormones, because as you manipulate insulin, as you give more insulin, they will gain more weight. As you give less insulin, they will have less weight. And the same with cortisol. So if you say, what is making us fat? Is it because we eat too much or exercise too little? Well, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. In fact, it's hormones. Obesity is really a hormonal dysregulation of the fat. And those two hormones are predominantly insulin and to a lesser extent cortisol. So this is the caloric reduction as primary therapy, as primary theory. And you can see that this is really not true, because when you think about it, it doesn't really work, because manipulating the eating doesn't lead to changes in weight. But the belief in this theory has led to a singular research focus on behavioral and psychological issues. That is it lack of willpower? Is it fast food? Is it sugar? And an entire generation of health professionals really endorsing this so-called low-fat caloric restriction as a treatment, Well, if you have the cause of it wrong, you simply can't understand the treatment. And really, as I said, it's a perfect record, unblemished by success. So this is the hormonal theory of obesity, which is how we understand it, that the high insulin and to a lesser extent cortisol levels leads to the obesity. And by changing these hormones, that actually leads us to these behaviors of eating more or exercising less. In other words, this is not the cause of obesity, it's actually the result of obesity. And that really sets you up for the proper question, because the proper question then is, if this is the result of obesity, what is the cause? And the cause leads you back to the hormones. So in other words, you're not getting fat because you're overeating. You're overeating because you're getting fat. That is, this is the result, not the cause. So now if we understand the cause, now we can start to treat it. So the real crucial question of obesity is not how many calories am I eating, because the calories are largely irrelevant. If you take more calories, your body will burn it off. If you take less calories, your bodies will burn less. It's what is driving my insulin levels up. And the first thing that was noticed is that it's the fattening carbohydrates. So all those sugary foods, starchy foods, are fairly well known to cause high insulin levels. And over time, that leads to obesity, which leads to the behaviors of overeating and under-exercising. So the answer really, or the first one that we've come up with, is the fattening carbohydrates. So if you go back to Banting, so this is not a new idea. In fact, it's a very, very old idea. In fact, most of our grandmothers, if you had asked them how to treat obesity, the first thing they would have said, stop the sweets and stop the starchy foods. That would have been the first answer. And that was what it was. The fattening carbohydrates leads to obesity. And as we see it now, the fattening carbohydrates leads to the increased insulin levels, which leads to the obesity. So really, the body acts as a set point. That is, it's not a scale. It's completely wrong to think of the body as a scale, a calories in, calories out scale. It is much more useful to think of the body as a thermostat. That is, what is setting my body weight set point? Why am I setting it too high, and how can I reset it to a proper level? And really, insulin or hormones are the major way that it resets. Insulin tells the body to get fat. And if you take it away, it will reset it down. So this leads us to, again, a very, very old idea. This was taken out of the practice of endocrinology in 1951. That is, if you are going to try to lose weight, there are foods that you need to avoid. There's bread and everything else made of flour, cereals, including breakfast cereals and milk puddings, potatoes and all other white root vegetables, foods containing much sugar, and all sweets. But on the flip side, there are foods you can eat as much as you like. That is meat, fish, birds, all green vegetables, eggs, dried or fresh, cheese, and fruit, if unsweetened, except bananas and grapes. And this, in a nutshell, is just something I found on the internet, which kind of explains carbs insulin for dummies. And what it is it takes a normal person, and as you eat the bad carbs, the insulin levels go cuckoo. The black box gets effed up. If you take an obese person and you simply cut their carbs, the insulin levels will normalize and the black box is fixed. So these are not really new ideas, but by trying to understand what is really the etiology of obesity, you can get much more rational treatments of obesity that fall more along physiological lines. And this is the final slide I have. This is the weight loss and nutrition clinics, which we're running. If there's any questions, I can be reached at drjasonfung@hotmail.com. Thanks.